Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the Operations Coordinator for CFAL York. I would like to officially open the 19th session and the first of our 2025 sessions in our Climate Change Emergencies and Cultural Heritage Speaker Series, which is being presented in partnership with Heritage Ottawa and World Heritage Catalysis. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Takaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Kourosh Atarian. Dr. Kourosh Atarian is an associate professor of architecture at the Jundi Shapur University of Technology and a postdoctoral fellow at York University. In 2018, Dr. Atarian became the vice chancellor of the Jundi Shapur Research Institute at the Jundi Shapur University of Technology. Dr. Atarian's research focuses on cultural heritage, cultural history, and architectural engineering. His research has been published in numerous leading journals on architecture, cultural heritage, and sustainability, and has been published in several books. Dr. Atarian is also a reviewer for several journals, including the Journal of Building Engineering, the Journal of Asian Architecture and Building Engineering, and the Journal of Cultural Heritage Management and Sustainable Development, among many others. Dr. Atarian, thank you very much for moderating today's session. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco, and welcome everyone for the 19th session of the All Speaker Series on Climate Change Emergencies and Cultural Heritage. And our guest today for us is Dr. Marcus Létourneau, and he will speak on the more things change and the more they stay the same. Reflections on the integration of climate change considerations and risk management into Ontario's heritage policy framework. And after the session, we will have the Q&A section, and should anyone have any question, please write it down on Q&A section, and we will reading them through, or you could raise your hand and ask your question. And to give a little introduction about Dr. Letourneau. Dr. Letourneau is the president of M.R. Letourneau and Associates Incorporation, a specialized heritage and strategic planning firm focused on creative solutions for management of cultural heritage resources. He is also an adjunct assistant professor in School of Planning and contributing associate for the Heritage Resources Center at the University of Waterloo, and an instructor for the both Cultural Resource Management Program at the University of Victoria and the Willowbank School of Restoration Arts. He co-teaches the Facilities Management course for the Ontario Museum Association. He currently serves on the chair and national representative of the interim board of Blue Shield Canada, on board of directors of ICOMOS Canada, as a trustee for the Kingston Frontenac Public Library, and as a chair of Leeds and Thousand Islands MHC. Dr. Létourneau brings over 20 years of experience to his practice, which is particularly focused on the heritage legislation, strategic planning, heritage planning, and processes. He has been involved in over 300 projects, either as a project director, project manager, and senior heritage planner. He's been qualified as an expert heritage witness for the Ontario Heritage Land Tribunal and as an expert witness for the both Superior Court hearing and judicial inquiry for the Public Lands Act. He co-authored the second edition of Heritage Planning, edition by Rutledge edition with Dr. Paul Kalman in 2020. I tried to make it brief. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Létourneau, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kush. One of the challenges with an introduction like that is you actually have to live up to it. So I hope people do enjoy the talk. Happy to have any questions at the end. I have included my contact information on the last slide. And if people do have comments, want to discuss further, I am more than happy. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I'm Krush, you can hear me okay?
Sure.
Perfect.
We hear you.
Yes,
So,
please.
Today, my talk is entitled The More Things Change, the More They Stay the Same. And as we go through the talk, hopefully you'll see why I've chosen this title. As Krush mentioned, I've been working in the heritage field now over 25. I have to update that aspect of my bio. But a lot of this is a reflection on what I have seen over my time working in the field. A particular focus of mine is praxis, that intersection between the theoretical work that I do as an academic, combined with the very pragmatic aspects that I often address as a practitioner. I do have to start, though, today with a couple of thank yous. As in any of our work, we never do this alone. I want to thank particularly Dr. Carl Bray, Ms. Kayla Jonas Galvin, Miss Alyssa Golden, my partner, Miss Virginia Letourneau, and actually my son, who helps me considerably with technological issues. I also want to note that many of the findings that I'm presenting today are part of a work in progress. And as a work in progress, there's, I think, lots of opportunities for greater conversations, but it's an acknowledgement that some of the information that I have found often requires, asking some more big questions about why, looking at documents in a little bit more detail to see what are the patterns that are emerging in these policy and procedural frameworks within the province of Ontario. So today, I'm going to go through a bit of an introduction. I am a land use planner, and that is a lens that I bring to my analysis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why planning matters, but also what is the impact of those frameworks upon how this intersection between climate change, disaster, and risk management intersect. I'll talk a little bit about the problems of the Romans and some other jurisdictional issues. We'll talk a little bit about some of the impacts that we are seeing in both Ontario and Canada. We'll talk about the sort of state of the union of disaster and risk management research in Ontario, and basically what I have found as part of my analysis today. And hopefully these are very positive steps. Some of the information may be surprising to some people when we actually think about the broader implications for practice. But I do try to end on a very positive note. One of the things that strikes me, though, when I read a lot of our literature on disaster risk management, on climate change, there are a lot of really good recommendations and a lot of good statements about the importance of the integration of cultural heritage into our emergency management programs and systems. And I like Dale Carnegie's quote: first ask yourself, what is the worst that can happen? Then prepare to accept it. Then proceed to improve upon the worst. And the nature of my talk is not to really repeat a lot of this research, but to acknowledge that it really is there. There's a lot of information that we can examine as practitioners. But my experience has been very different. I have found in practice, heritage is not regularly a consideration. And really, I have found often that the response is why do we need to worry? Why is this important to us? And I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. At the beginning of my career, I was actually the senior heritage planner, senior heritage practitioner for the city of Kingston in Ontario. which, for those of you unfamiliar with Canada, is one of Canada's oldest cities. It was founded in 1673. Kingston is known for its historic architecture. We have a very strong archaeological program. We are working to integrate ICH into the city's operations. But as part of my duties, it was to update a lot of these policies and processes. Our city hall is an early 1840s structure, and this is how it looks today in the photograph below. And we, in the process of creating our emergency management plan for the city hall, in our heritage management plan, we started to say, well, what happens? What are the worst case scenarios for city hall? It's a very tall building. What happens if it's struck by lightning? We have had floods in the area. We've had tornadoes come through our community. And the response from some of my colleagues was literally, you have very dark thoughts. And I sort of looked at my colleague and said, well, why would you say that? And it's like, bad things won't happen here. This is Kingston City Hall as it appeared shortly after it was built. You might notice its appearance is very different. The dome is different. That front entrance is different. You actually had a almost roadway, marketway that went into a rear wing. You had smaller columns and a slightly different pediment on the front of the building. You also had a significant addition to the rear of the building, a huge market hall that was used for a variety of city businesses and indeed even factories. In 1865, this market wing burned to the ground. Arson was suspected. And subsequent to the fire, the addition was demolished in the wonderful politics of the day. £21,000 in insurance was paid and £9,000 was spent on the renovation. But this is how City Hall looked post-fire. One of the big things that they also changed was if you look at the City Hall dome, you'll see that there's a clock. The dome structure has been changed. Some of the money went into revitalizing the building. Now, nearly 50 years had passed when they decided to repair the City Hall clock. During that renovation, it caught fire. It was rebuilt, and we have these wonderful drawings about the work that was supposed to have been done. I had the chance to actually examine the structure, and in many cases, the scorched elements were still part of the building. So bringing this full circle, I went back, and I said to my colleague, this is a building that's had 2 major fires since its initial construction. There were smaller fires. There were other incidents. Why wouldn't we be having these conversations and thoughts about what do we do in the event of an emergency at a very prominent city site? Now, in the nature of my talk, I'm going to give a little bit of context. I sort of draw quite heavily on the Guide to Risk Management for Cultural Heritage in a lot of my work, the CCI publication. And I like the fact that context is really an important component of this. It helps us set that framework for the identification of risk, the analysis and the evaluation. It also is an upfront activity. As a planner, one of the things that I am trained to do is look at a 20 to 50 year window. Unfortunately, that again is often in theory, and in practice, as a profession, I find we are often very reactive to issues. So when we think about heritage, we have to think about that political environment. We have to think about the actors and stakeholders. The administrative and operational aspects. What is that financial context? What are the legal aspects? What is the physical environment? And what is that social cultural environment? And how is that applied to the work that we do? For those of you who are not familiar with Canada, Canada is a huge country. Ontario is sort of centrally located. We share a significant border with the United States. Our environment goes from quite warm Carolina type weather. We have fruit trees in southern Ontario. up to almost an Arctic environment in Northern Ontario. The image on the right is just sort of a comparison of Ontario with Europe. So you can give a sense. So I know someone mentioned that they were from Oslo. You would almost travel from Oslo down to Venice, and that would be the size of Ontario. So we have a tremendous diversity, tremendous area. But the reality is most of our population is within 100 kilometers of the US border. It is predominantly located in southern Ontario, along the Great Lakes and along particularly the St. Lawrence Seaway. So we have, again, tremendous population. The population of Ontario is about 15 million. But we have a lot of people and increased density in a particular part of the province. Another important consideration when talking about the Ontario context is the fact that we are a federated state. Canada was created out of several colonies, British colonies. The Constitution in Canada divides up areas of responsibility or spheres of jurisdiction between the federal and the provincial government. Indigenous issues rest with the federal government. Culture, heritage, planning is predominantly a provincial responsibility. And the province sets out the rules and the guidelines that are then provided to the municipalities or regional governments who take responsibility for that implementation of the provincial direction. What that means in practice, Canada is the only G7 nation without a National Heritage Act. There are some federal acts that deal with heritage. The most recent effort, Bill C-23, has effectively died in Parliament. And the sense is within the heritage community, it will not be proceeding before our next election. What this means as well is there's tremendous variation across Canada in terms of how provinces actually address cultural heritage and how they integrate it within other areas of spheres of jurisdiction. Now, as a planner, our training is focused upon looking at issues holistically, looking at, and this is the definition from the United Nations. It is involved with that systematic assessment of change, of what is important to protect, how does change happen in such a way that key areas of interest, key components of the ecosystem, key elements of human life are protected. Basically, how do we best meet the needs of the people while safeguarding resources? And this is actually from the Canadian Institute of Planners. And it's an acknowledgement that planners cannot, in theory, work in silos. We have to see the interconnections between heritage conservation, social planning, transportation planning, economic development, land use planning, land development, environment resource management. And I would push this further, emergency management, municipal operations. All of these have to be discussed, and planners really need to discuss how we will integrate and balance many of these considerations. And the reality is for planners, there's a lot of things that we have to take into account. I have often heard as a practitioner, why should we care about heritage when so much else is going on in the world? And my response, and I say this to my students, is we cannot forget that there are numerous works that have identified how cultural heritage is an integral part of both individual and group identity. Increased research is showing there is a connection between health and heritage. And there is a relationship between sustainable development and cultural heritage. But that's not often really understood. As an example, I was talking to a dean at one of the academic institutions that I work at. And this is someone who is very knowledgeable about planning and environment. And they said, well, heritage isn't the only connection between heritage and sustainability, cultural landscape. And that's when I realized that we are not doing sufficient training or knowledge to our colleagues on these important interconnections. But I also think it's really important that we have to think about the fundamental origins of where some of our practice comes from. And I like to say blame it on the Romans. Actually, I should more accurately say blame it on Roman law. When we go back to Roman law, I turn to the concept of res, or thing, which eventually became associated with this idea of property. So in the Roman Empire, property essentially meant any asset that had economic value. And this is actually a very simplification, I realize, but essentially what Roman law did is it divided these assets into movable and immovable assets, but also tangible and intangible assets. Basically, it was anything where value could be extracted. So an example that I saw in some of the readings that I did around this topic was the idea of reputation or lifeways as an important intangible asset. And we see this concept and echoes of this concept into how we consider cultural heritage resources. We see this in a lot of the diagrams that are produced on how we explain what a cultural heritage resource is and these interconnections. But, you know, there's a lot more research that has looked at how cultural heritage cannot really be broken down in this way. When we think about holistic approaches, we have to think about the interconnections, how you cannot so easily distinguish between these different aspects when we are looking at resource types. Now, where does that play out? In my experience, that actually plays out in how we consider cultural heritage within our existing legislative framework. And going back to that diagram of the differences, as a planner in Ontario, there's numerous different pieces of legislation that reference heritage, that have a component of heritage. But these are often under the responsibility of different levels of government, often different planning types. I have found in an experience working in municipalities, the building code is under often the building department, and there's not always a conversation between the building departments and the planning departments. But also, when you look at the local level, municipalities create, in many respects, their own local policies about how they are going to address some of these provincial directions. And in Ontario planning law, this is our definition of cultural heritage resources. Built heritage resources, cultural heritage landscapes, and archaeological resources that have been determined to have cultural heritage or value or interest for the important contribution they make to our understanding of the history of a place, event, or people. We are predominantly focused upon immovable heritage with some slight reference to archaeological resources. Heritage sort of planning in Ontario does not regularly take into account things like artifacts or ICH. And this has even been put into place by our Ministry of, now it's Citizenship and Multiculturalism. The name changes about every 2 to 3 years. But essentially, the ministry about 20 years ago put out a statement that there are 3 broad categories: immovable heritage, intangible heritage. And our policies, process, and legislation are built very much around these concepts. So Even within the ministry, museums are addressed separately from archaeology, which is addressed separately from built heritage such as buildings and landscapes. So even within the ministry responsible, you are not seeing sort of that overlap. You're not seeing those conversations. And what it happens in practice is you have a variety of different heritage organizations or subfields doing work independently from each other. So when I talk about emergency risk management for collections, I would say the museum sector in Ontario is far and away better prepared and thinking about this in a much more rigorous way than I am actually seeing within the built heritage community. And our legislation spells out really what we are supposed to do. So for most municipalities, the overarching planning document is an official plan. And our Planning Act spells out what that document should contain. You'll notice it does not say anything about heritage, but it does argue that official plans need to have climate change policies. However, cultural heritage, health and emergency management, appropriate built form, provisions, the protection of natural resources, we see these all stated, though, within the same legislation as a matter of public interest, as something that should be addressed by municipalities. And the term we use, and this is for those of us who are policy wonks, we have to look very carefully at the terms that are used within our legislation. So for example, under the provincial interests, decision makers shall have regard for these issues. It doesn't say thou must address them. It says we shall have regard for. And in my experience, there is a tremendous variation in how decision makers have regard for something. That being said, the provincial planning statement does have very clear statements for the protection of heritage. It does have very clear statements which municipalities and decision makers must conform with. But what we see is that there isn't necessarily a very clear connection between heritage, energy conservation, sustainability, and emergency risk management. We have very broad statements. So I'm going to draw your attention to the last line in the first paragraph on the top box. Potential risks to public health and safety, or of property damage from natural hazards and human-made hazards, including the risks associated with the impact of climate change, will be mitigated. It's really interesting because I find that there's not a lot of direction on how we do this for cultural heritage. One of the areas that the province and I've seen the federal government are making important strides are work with our Indigenous communities. And again, though, the Indigenous matters are primarily what's called a crown matter. So it's federal government or the provincial government. Now, as planners at the local level, we have now been told as part of our new planning statement that we shall engage for heritage. But again, there's no clear direction on what that should look like. We do have in Ontario, the Ontario Heritage Act, which governs many aspects of heritage conservation, property designation, some archaeological legislation, how our what's called our Ontario Heritage Trust works, what its rules are, how things are appealed. And I wanted to, knowing that I only have about an hour, bring this group's attention to Heritage Conservation District plans. These are the plans that protect large areas within municipalities. And there are very prescribed content of such plans. Statements of, what are the objectives? Statement examining the cultural heritage value or interest. What are the heritage attributes? And providing policy statements, guidelines, and procedures for achieving the stated objectives. A description of heritage alterations that are minor in nature. In Ontario, under the Heritage Act, you have the ability to delegate authority to a staff member for certain approval types. And one of the things that some municipalities have started exploring is using that power for emergency and disaster risk management scenarios. That being said, in the Ontario context, particularly since 2018, we have seen tremendous changes in our legislation. Our Heritage Act is going to be undergoing changes again. We found that out last November. And our Auditor General, so the person who does sort of the oversight, in 2021 actually said all of these changes are creating instability. There is insufficient guidance how to implement these policies. There has to be greater collaboration between the provincial government and these municipalities. And in 2023, when they did sort of a report card on this assessment, very little change had occurred. Climate change is having an impact on the Ontario context. And again, there are some really great recommendations out there. And this is from the Heritage-Based Climate Action Conference report. There are great recommendations out of this. The integration of heritage protection within these plans. Focus on areas of vulnerability. And one of the big areas in Ontario is flooding. Coordinate to develop accessible financing. Develop tools and methods. Focusing target and training. And without going through all of these components, there is an idea that we have to be part of the conversation. We need to be creating these tools. We need to be looking at the different ways that we can approach this problem. Looking at some of the documentations, again, early warning systems, work with governments. Now, I'm going to give an example, though, of where some of these challenges are. So in Canada, actually, there is a recent funding for new homeowners because we are in a housing crisis. What struck me is that the funding is for new builds or tear downs. There was no funding provided for new homeowners to buy and rehabilitate existing structures. We are seeing these impacts in a variety of different ways. We are seeing changes to the environment. We are seeing changes in water level. We are seeing increased frequency of storms, increased intensity, increased coastal erosion, loss of permafrost. I'm actually working on a project in Dawson City right now, and that is a major concern of what will that mean? Fire. There are significant fires that have occurred across Ontario. And when I talk to people about starting to think about risk, the next series of slides usually shock people to realize that scope and the scale. This is confirmed tornadoes across Ontario, and this is now outdated. There's some great resources online through a project at Western, but you are seeing more tornadoes. You are seeing increased frequency. You are seeing this happening. Ottawa has suffered several tornadoes in the last couple of years. One of the big examples that we saw in terms of heritage and emergency response, Goderich tornado in August 2011, where you had a tornado go through a heritage conservation district. And the community has recovered, but I would point to Goderich, and I will point to a thesis which actually examined what Goderich did. There were a lot of lessons coming out of that event on where some of these gaps were and where improvements needed to be made. Flooding, and you're starting to see, particularly around Lake Erie, major flooding events. This is the town of Tecumseh starting to map. I'm working on a project with the City of Windsor on a heritage district where part of the heritage district is located within that floodplain. Forest fires. Even particularly in Eastern Ontario, there are seismic concerns. And lastly, one of the issues that we are starting to look at more seriously is political instability, particularly historic sites that serve as key landmarks within the community. One of the messages, though, and this is an older reference, I include it because I still find it very reference, that when we tend to think of these places, we often ignore that emotional element. It is not just the loss of a building. For many people, it is the loss of community. It is that loss of identity that is really, really important. And many of our plans don't take that into account or consider how cultural heritage does contribute in that way. And again, this is the notion that we are not planning for the if. We need to be planning for the when. We have to be thinking about, going back to that example of City Hall, this is a when. This is not an if. How do we address the priorities? So with a lot of the literature, and I've pulled this from the World Bank, basically we summarize it often in this idea that we have to integrate cultural heritage assets into existing disaster management plans. And we have to basically better protect these resources in advance. So it's looking at those proactive measures for protection. And again, we have to realize that security concerns are increasing at many of these places, and we have to integrate that into our thinking as well. These are just sort of examples that I was able to get from Homeland Security in the US of some of the measures used to integrate culturally, or not culturally, contextually appropriate interventions designed to protect heritage resources. But this is from a book now that's about 10 years old on security. There's often questions about how do we integrate these things into buildings that were never designed for them. And often I work with colleagues for things like courthouses that often are very difficult to adapt. And often the response is we have to move out of this building because we can't address the security concerns. But I'm going to jump back to another project by Spennyman. And this was something that always sat in the back of my mind as I worked on heritage projects, was this idea that, you know, based on his analysis in New South Wales, and this is back in 2003, the overwhelming majority did not address things like climate change, disaster emergency management. Or if they did it in a very light way. And I was always curious about what have we learned in the last 20 years? Are we actually looking at the literature? Are we engaging with these concepts? My colleague, Kyla Jonas Galvin, and again, I want to thank her very much, actually wrote her master's thesis in 2016 on this exact issue. And it is very much a worthwhile thesis to read. Things have changed in terms of some of the legislation. But one of the big things that she highlighted right at the outset is that a research gap exists at the intersection of planning, emergency management, and heritage conservation in Ontario. And she basically looked at the fact that, you know, there are different ways that we can meet the disaster stage and things that we can actually do as practitioners to, you know, address how cultural heritage resources are addressed within a disaster emergency management situation. And again, her research was on this disaster in Goderich. And she created a summary of a number of best practices and actions. And I was talking to her last week in preparation for this talk, and I said, so what have you seen done coming out of her thesis? And she was like, almost nothing. You know, many municipalities have not actually engaged with these ideas. More recently, and this was a former student of mine, I didn't do his thesis, but I was one of his professors at Queen's, looked at how, you know, what are the toolkits for doing this analysis in floodplain management? How do we integrate built heritage resources? So again, a very specific focus on a very specific term. But again, this is an important first step. But the reality is there hasn't been a lot of research. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'll get into those in a few minutes. We also, in terms of our legislation, have requirements for each municipality to create an emergency management plan. And again, like a lot of the heritage legislation, a lot of those specific details are prescribed. You know, the hazard and risk assessment, the identification of necessary goods, services, and resources. Who should be involved? Who can provide additional information? So this brings me to the status of where we are at. So as part of this preparation of this talk, I went back. I started examining all of the publicly available documents I could find. Many municipalities have done heritage conservation districts. A few have done what's called a heritage management master plan, and 13 of those are available online. Now, although they're not required, municipalities are encouraged to do these sorts of things. Of the 13 that I examined, only 2 had an explicit reference to emergency risk management or climate change. A third one did say that there is a risk from tourism because tourists like to touch stuff. And that is literally the phrase that was used in this document. And the 2 that I've found, one was draft, where it talked about the need to create emergency procedures. But Halton is actually one of, I think, the more detailed heritage management plans, which actually includes a strategy, steps that can be taken to address climate change and address risk management. Ontario, as I mentioned, a lot falls to the municipality. And there are 444 municipalities within Ontario. Only 2 have what I call publicly available, so you actually know that they exist, heritage emergency protocols. And these are Hamilton and Kitchener. Kitchener's is heavily modeled after Hamilton. And again, I thank my colleagues at the City of Hamilton. They are in the process of updating it. But these are the only 2 communities that have really made that next step to say, we need an emergency management protocol, at least which are publicly available. In Ontario, we have over 135 heritage conservation districts. Not all of the plans are available online. And 113 of these plans I examined, and I looked specifically for topics related to climate change, disaster risk management. Of these, only 35 had a reference to climate change or disaster risk management. And 27 of those were what I would call passing references. So in the event of a natural disaster, you can demolish this building. That would almost be the limit of the reference. And only 8 had more substantive sections or discussions. Now, I would note that having more substantive sections of discussion did not necessarily mean that there was more direction or detail, just that it was recognized in more places. So these are sort of a couple of examples out of half of those that had something. So one had a lot of discussion on sustainable development and that connection between climate change. The image on the right is actually from an updated HCD plan in Goderich, where they had a very detailed section on risk management strategies and what needs to be done. And there's a series of policies and guidelines in that document. We see often it's like the image on the left, emergency work. The idea that we don't necessarily have to follow that formal process in the event of an emergency. And the last one on the right I found was a really interesting one, which actually looked at very specific recommendations on the intersection between cultural heritage landscape and flooding and protection of natural areas. I looked through the emergency management plans in a number of provinces, and the reality is none referenced heritage except Port Hope. And again, that was a passing reference that heritage is an important part of the community and we should protect it. I'm skipping over that little video and I'm happy to share, But I saw this actually within my experience working in the city of Kingston. When I worked in Kingston, I was in the same unit as the emergency management team. And when it came to the emergency management plan, my role was identified as non-critical. And I had a talk with my boss, and I'm like, but I'm actually the person who does emergency approvals for heritage. Oh, we didn't think of that. And that comment has stuck with me for well over 15 years. Some municipalities have started to require, though, things like temporary protection plans, building protection plans. Most have implemented some form of a heritage impact assessment. But again, these are not typically focused upon emergency situations. They're around proposed interventions, often related to a specific project, or in some cases, mothballing. So my observations, and I will be finished in just a couple minutes, risk or impacts within a lot of these documents tend to be positioned as the result of development or agents of deterioration. We are not seeing impacts being discussed in a way that they relate to emergency. And if you go back to Herb Stovall's work, Herb makes the point that a disaster can cause greater impact than a long period of natural decay. A lot of the documents that do include the references tend to be focused on the post-emergency disaster phase. You're not seeing a lot of work on how do we prepare. The other thing I noted in going through a lot of the plans is some of these plans are 20, 25 years old. And there's no requirement for plans to be updated to reflect new circumstances, new research, new ideas. Many of these plans include passing references, demolition permits. You know, if this happens, then you can do this. Not all plans are available. And I think that's a really important point. If we are to be managing these resources, if we are to look at this in the public interest, these plans and documents need to be readily available. I also note a lot of commonality within language, a lot of templates. And I saw, particularly in the emergency management plans, the province has created a template, and they've been carried forward without careful consideration of the local context. And I also see in a lot of these documents the use of permissive language. And as a planner, there's a big difference between a should, which is a guideline, and a shall, which is you really need to do this. So why? Why are we in this situation? There's a variety of reasons I've seen in my experience. There's a lot of perceptions about what heritage conservation is. And I've heard so many conversations that you're a soft service, you're a nice to have. Again, that interconnection between community and identity, emotion, health, identity is not clear in many people's minds. The legislation have their limits. As a planner, I can only focus on particular things. There is not that emphasis upon holistic approach. We see a tremendous turnover of experts in our field, within many of the fields. And you may have an agreement, for example, with another department if you're in a municipality, but people change, and then you've got to do that rebuilding again. Insurance, particularly in Ontario, is driving a lot of conversations right now about what's appropriate, and heritage, again, is seen inherently as a risk. We're seeing siloing of experts. We're seeing a limited number of professionals who are often reacting rather than planning. Right now, a lot of heritage planners in Ontario are focused upon moving listed properties to designation. And I put sort of the cat amongst the pigeons and say, should we be doing that if our management policies and processes are not in place? Should we be doing more designations? There are limited educational and training opportunities. Those that exist are often difficult to find, or you have to know where to find them. Faculty are predominantly part-time adjunct who often cannot do research or supervise theses. There is limited access for heritage people to the emergency management conversation. Events like this are some of the rare opportunities. I'd also really sort of challenge, we have a values-based evaluative system in Ontario, but we have no prioritization system. So in the event of an emergency, what do we prioritize? How do we do that? And the last point is really that heritage must be a positive. And it's this idea that we can't talk about, you know, heritage is important to economic development, tourism, but how do we manage it manage heritage in the worst case scenario. And I'd often say as well to some of my colleagues, we do tend to be a little myopic sometimes. We tend to be focused upon the details, where we can often be missing that big picture around us. And even the best of us can get caught. And the picture on the right is actually a flood that occurred in my office last July while I was at an emergency management conference. And I learned very quickly that even my own process in my office was not as good as I thought it should be. So best practices, BC Hearn, which is predominantly a museums program, but it's looking at how to bring together experts to respond to these situations. Parks Canada is looking at climate change and national historic sites, but I've found that Parks Canada doesn't always engage with municipal planners at that provincial level. ICROM and CCI have done some great work in the ABC method. If you haven't looked at it, I really recommend it. But again, how do heritage planners and planners in general learn about such things? And again, there are some courses out there, and this is just from the Heritage Resource Management program at Athabasca. And there are efforts for things like Blue Shield, and there is an effort to create a national committee here in Canada. We're just in the process of finishing the bylaws. So to finish, this presentation represents really initial work and examination. I'd like to actually track down some of the newer or missing HCD plans. I'd like to review for what I call oblique references. We need to look at municipal official plans and other planning documents to see what's being done. We need to review more of the emergency management plans and really try and find a way to access some of these in-house documents to see what protocols might exist outside of the public realm. There is the need for new educational and training opportunities. And rather than just saying that generically, I am working with CCI and ICROM to try and bring that disaster and emergency management training to Canada. We need broader engagement. And far from just saying it generically, we need to be going to conferences. We need to be writing the articles. We need to be doing the research. Though I would draw people's attention that there are changes coming to the Ontario Heritage Act. And I'd like to see it as an opportunity that perhaps now we can get this on the agenda. Thank you for your patience. I know that was a lot of information, and I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you, Marcus, for very insightful. I'm sorry, I turned off my camera. Thank you, Marcus, for that insightful presentation. You've highlighted intersection between the climate change risk management and particularly how I really like that, how you categorize the policies in Built Heritage Ontario. So we can head into the questions. So let me check, please.
I just want to give a shout out, Carly Connor. Thank you for noting CAHP is actually doing the Codes Acceleration Fund with energy carbon to spark the discussion between sustainability and the integration of policies. Thank you for bringing that attention. I have a talk next week in a week and a half with CAHP, so thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you. I was to read it as well. Thank you. So we have a question here by Karen. If I can pronounce it well. So she said that why are they making change to the Ontario Heritage Act, I guess? How make that decision to do so? Why they have the skills to do so? I think what
you are asking the question that many of us in the heritage field are asking. There is a perception within certain sectors that heritage gets in the way of development. There was a study in 2021 on the Affordable Housing Task Force, which I won't get into that report, but essentially it highlighted heritage as a barrier to creating new and affordable housing. This is a political issue. The issue of consultation is one that has been a matter of discussion and debate. CAHP is actually going to be running with the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals several upcoming workshops that should be announced in the next day or two to provide input. But there is a concern that will that input actually be heard, or is this a predetermined outcome? what we have seen is an effort actually in many respects to make it harder to identify and protect cultural heritage resources. And municipalities are struggling. I hope that helped.
Thank you very much. So we have another question by Payman Naimi. As you mentioned about the BCIN, how do you think that the built heritage consideration and climate adaptation can be added in building codes concerning departmental policies? Yeah,
It comes
it
back.
makes
It's a challenging question. I think in some cases, it's having those conversations. Heritage is not a required part of planning education. It's something that I've advocated for, that planners should have environmental, climate change, and heritage and social education as part of their planning degrees. It's not required. It's getting into things like official plan discussions. Community members can provide input. Sometimes that's integrated, sometimes it's not. I think the challenge is understanding what heritage is and can do for a community. I remember actually having discussions as part of official plan updates saying, well, how is heritage relevant beyond protecting buildings? So we are often starting from quite far back and having to move forward. And I think some of the ways that this can be done, we can push and advocate for changes to legislation that require sort of like that statement out of the Planning Act saying official plans must deal with climate change. I would say we need to have statements that official plans need to integrate some policies around disaster and risk management. Because again, you have emergency management plans that don't often overlap with some of these official plans.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And is there any questions by the?
I see Kathy Daly has a raised hand.
Yes, but oh, she wrote it down here. So I agree with the exploiting the different heritage resources in a problem in many places. This is now built into the governance departments, discipline, and etc. In your experience, are there ways of bridging these gaps? It seems to be a concern at the government level not to overstep their areas of responsibility, so that it can be hard to widen approaches to the heritage planning to be inclusive as a result. So
Ooh, it's a good question. It's actually something that I've been struggling with myself, because it's starting with that conversation, I think. This is a conversation that I've seen come up at places like the ICOMOS board of how do we become part of the conversation? How do we bring people? How do you bring people together to have this conversation? I mean, we had a conference a number of years ago, some people are aware, in Quebec, focused on this issue. And I suppose the question I would put out is it time for us to have another conference, to have another event, to bring people together to have this conversation, so that you're not going to necessarily have that immediate impact, but that relationship building, that ability to have conversations is where, in my experience, is the best place to start.
and there's another question by Jokotola Omitiji, and he agrees to have some, the researchers, as you said, and I guess he's focusing on the implementations. He said that there's, as you said, that there's no implementation. So he asked that, is there any way to bridge the gap between planning and policies, and they include a shall and should? Oh, where are these questions? Okay, should phrases and proactive heritage protection during the building process.
Ooh, yeah. It's hard. I think the first step is people have to understand what we contribute. It's going to places like the Ontario, the Association of Ontario's Municipalities Conference, and saying this is how we integrate. Getting the conversation at the political level often, in my experience, means that the planners pay a little bit more attention to it. I know from my experience within municipal government, if there was a concern by, I had an archaeological issue which was raised by a councillor and we had to respond. But when you bring forward these plans, if the politicians and senior managers understand that, why this is important, how this can be integrated and how it fits, I think that's an important way for implementation. I think it also goes back to what are we training? How are we training? And how do we have these conversations between the different experts? One of the things I really noticed was this use of templates. I hate to say it, is part of the solution to create the template to say, this is what you need to integrate. Here are the policies you should be looking at. Is there room right now in the province of Ontario to develop a white paper on how do you do this?
Thank you very much. I guess we ran out of time, so I have another questions, but I don't know that
I'm happy to stay if people have questions. So
yes. So if there's another question,
and if people want to contact me
yes.
directly, I have put my email at the bottom left of the screen.
Yes, thank you. Really appreciate it. I will write down one for you. So another question by Heather Gill Freaking, if I pronounce it well. Do you think that there are simply too many cooks and that is impossible to know who is responsible for that and who is doing what, while integration would be the dream? It seems impossible, particularly when you try to integrate concepts that are not well represented presently. And I see on the ICOMOS Canada, I said a World Heritage Advisory Board, and constantly have to advocate the ICH in discussions, for example. Yes, thank you, Heather. So,
And I think
what do you think?
I think I would add, based upon my experience, a lot of impact is at the local level. And I think that's one of the things that we can do. Is you're absolutely right. There are way too many people. People don't know each other. We don't know where to go. But I think looking at important initiatives at the local level, integrating things into planning documents at a local level can make an impact.
And see, we don't any questions or so.
So it's an interesting question came up in the chat from Cecilia.
I guess
That is a big
yes.
question.
I guess here.
Around the aspect of Roman law. I think advance our approach by looking to nuances in Roman law lost in the current discourse. Absolutely. I think the other piece that we can do is look at other models. This is something we are seeing in Canada, particularly with work with Indigenous communities. Trondek Quechin in the Yukon have actually created their own heritage law. And they basically say there is no artificial distinction. We see these as all integrated. And I think that's important because we need to be looking at what are the different ways in which we can examine this. So I would be happy to talk further.
Okay, so let's see. Cecily, and is there any question? So let's check. So if there's not any. So maybe we can, and I will do that. So if anyone has any questions, so we can send an email to Marcus, and right now we can close the session. Thank you very much, Marcus. It was very insightful talk. I really like that. So there are many questions that I have. I will send it to you. So I go back to Francesco. So thank you very much, Francesco, and would you please close the session?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to give some quick thanks. I know we're a little over time, so thank you to everyone who stuck around with us. Thank you to Dr. Létourneau for taking the time to be here today, and for that great presentation and for the great discussion that with our audience members. Thank you as well to Dr. Atarian for all of your help putting together this series and for moderating today's session. Thank you as well to World Heritage Catalysis and Heritage Ottawa for being our partners in this series. And of course, thank you to everybody in the audience for being here, taking the time to participate, ask questions, and stay, even though we were a little over time. So I hope you all enjoyed the session. I hope you all learned a lot. I know I sure did. And thank you once again to everybody. Just two quick reminders. This is still a monthly series, so we will be having another session on Monday, March 3rd. And we have also recorded this session. So if you would like to revisit it or share it with any colleagues that may not have been able to attend today, it'll be on our YouTube channel, and it'll also be embedded on our event page where you registered. So yeah, you'll find it there hopefully within the next couple of hours, and please feel free to share that and the series with anyone who might be interested. With that, just one last big thank you to everybody. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.